past midnight, in the earliest hours of the 17th of July, 1918, 11 people were woken and told to get dressed. They were led down a staircase into a half-basement room at the back of a merchant's house in the city of Yekaterinburg, on the eastern edge of the Ural Mountains. The room measured about 20 feet by 16. One small barred window sat high in the wall. They were told they were being moved for their safety, and that first they would wait here. Chairs were carried in for the mother and for the sick boy. The others stood. A man walked in with a squad behind him and a sheet of paper in his hand, and he read out that they were to be shot. What was meant to fill the next 20 minutes was an execution. On the table today, in this case across more than a century, the bodies say it was something worse. It was an execution that failed at the first attempt, and the reason it failed had been sewn by hand into the clothing of 4 young women. This is what the bodies say. The subjects are 11 human beings, 2 adults in middle age, a man and his wife, 5 of their children, 4 daughters and 1 son, the boy a hemophiliac, a physician, a cook, a footman, a maid. In the language of a case file, this is a mass-casualty shooting event. 11 decedents in one enclosed space. The man was Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia. The woman was his wife, Alexandra. The children were the Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and the Tsarevich Alexei. The 4 who died beside them were Dr. Eugene Botkin, the cook Ivan Kharitonov, the footman Alexei Trupp, and the maid Anna Demidova. By that night, they had been prisoners since the spring, held under armed guard in a requisitioned house the Bolsheviks called the House of Special Purpose. The windows had been painted over. The family filled the long days with lessons and reading, and short turns around a small yard. And in the quiet hours, the 4 daughters were doing something with their hands that would matter more, forensically, than anything else in this case. I will come to it. One fact sets this case apart from almost every other file this channel has opened. These 11 people received no autopsy in 1918. That silence was deliberate. The men who killed them spent the following 3 days working to guarantee that their bodies would never lie on a table and be read. They failed at that too. The autopsy did happen. It happened 73 years later, and then again 16 years after that. Performed on bone by anthropologists and geneticists rather than by a pathologist with a fresh body. But the questions were the same ones I would put to any decedent: cause of death, mechanism, manner, and in this case, one more question that most cases are spared: whose body is this? The historical record for most of the 20th century gave a clean and confident answer to the first question. The Romanovs were shot by a Bolshevik firing squad in the cellar of the Ipatiev house. Shot, killed, and disposed of. The story sounded efficient because the people telling it wanted it to. A revolution that has just shot a family, 4 young women and a boy among them, has an interest in the word quick. The order to kill them came down from the regional Soviet in the Urals. The killing itself was handed to a man named Yakov Yurovsky, who ran the house and assembled the squad. Yurovsky gathered 14 handguns for the job. That number matters, and we will return to it, because 14 loaded handguns in a room 20 feet across, fired at close range more or less at once, should leave no one in that room breathing for more than a few seconds. They left people breathing. That is the finding this whole case turns on. There is a moment early in any shooting reconstruction when the physical evidence stops agreeing with the story you were handed. Here, that moment arrives fast. A firing squad exists to do one thing well. This one did the opposite. Now, to the table itself. Begin with the external examination, the way any autopsy begins. Before the skeletons, look at what the killers themselves put on the record, because the shooters left accounts, and those accounts describe a body-level finding that went straight past everyone in that room at the time. When the squad opened fire, the front rank went down. The father, shot first and at close range, died within seconds. But the small room flooded almost instantly with smoke and plaster dust thrown up by the muzzle blasts, and the shooters lost sight of what they were firing at. They fired blind over one another's shoulders into the haze. Something close to 70 rounds went into that space, roughly 7 from each man. And when the smoke thinned, the 4 daughters were still alive, barely wounded, several of them hardly marked at all. The bullets had struck them and skidded away without reaching anything vital. Some of the shooters, in their own later testimony, described rounds ricocheting off the girls and snapping back across the room, and for a few seconds these hardened men believed they were watching something with no natural cause. They thought the bullets were bouncing off the bodies. The bullets were bouncing off what the bodies were wearing. Through the long weeks of captivity, the 4 Grand Duchesses had taken the family's remaining diamonds and precious stones and stitched them by hand into custom-made undergarments, hidden inside the linings of corset-like bodices worn against the skin. This was survival, not decoration. A hidden fortune carried on the body, meant to be smuggled into exile and to buy their lives if the family ever reached freedom. The published estimate of the stones concealed this way runs to roughly 1 1/3 kilograms. Nearly 3 pounds of hard, faceted, tightly packed gemstone layered densely across the torso of each young woman. In forensic terms, a dense, hard, layered mass worn tight over the chest and abdomen is body armor. Crude, improvised, accidental armor, but armor all the same. Against the low-velocity handgun rounds crossing that cellar, it held. The girls who had sewn a fortune into their clothes to survive their imprisonment had, without ever knowing it, armored themselves against their own firing squad. Years ago, on the Georgia coast, a body crossed my table wearing a winter coat far too heavy for the season, with a whole life sewn into its lining. An older woman who kept her savings clear of every bank, who carried everything she owned in thick folded layers against her chest. She had been shot once, square in the sternum at close range. The round that should have driven straight through her heart spent itself in the wadding and the folded bills and the coins and stopped short. That first shot left her alive. The second one to the head was the one that killed her. I have never forgotten how the clothing rewrote the entire reading of those wounds. The bullet behaved in a way the shooter would have sworn was impossible, because the clothing reached the fight first. That is precisely what unfolded in the cellar in Yekaterinburg, multiplied by 4, and the men doing the shooting were baffled by it. So they escalated. This is the stretch where an already ugly scene becomes the thing the title of this case calls botched. The order went out to finish the survivors with bayonets, and the bayonets struggled too, glancing off the same stone-packed bodices. The accounts describe the blades as useless against the torso. In the end, the 4 daughters and the others still clinging on were killed by gunshots pressed directly to the head, one at a time, deliberately, because the first 2 methods had both come apart. An execution is meant to be, whatever else you make of it, a single controlled act. The whole thing ran about 20 minutes. 20 minutes, in a room the size of a small bedroom, for 14 armed men to kill 11 unarmed prisoners. That accounts for how they died. How we can read it in bone 90 years on is a different question. For that we have to leave the cellar and follow the dead into the forest, because the killer's next problem was the same as their first. The bodies refused to cooperate. Move with me to the skeletal examination. The remains that anthropologists finally laid out on their tables came from 2 graves found 16 years apart in the Koptiaki forest north of the city. And the condition of those remains is itself a finding. It is the physical record of the second botched job. After the killings, the bodies were loaded onto a truck and hauled out to a disused mine shaft called the Four Brothers. The plan was to destroy them there. But rumors were already moving through Yekaterinburg about where the family had been taken, and the mine was too well known, too easy to find. So the corpses were dragged back out and moved a second time. 5 minutes down the road, the truck sank to its axles in mud. What followed was pure improvisation, and the bones still carry the marks of it. Unable to free the truck, the men decided to bury the family right where they had stalled, in the low, boggy ground of a place later called Porosenkov Log. the pig's meadow. They dug a shallow pit in the road itself. Before covering the dead, they poured sulfuric acid over them, meant to eat away the flesh and dissolve the faces. Yurovsky had already ordered the faces smashed with rifle butts, so that even a discovered grave would offer no skull anyone could match to a photograph of an emperor. Then, fearing that a single grave holding the exact right number of people would give the whole thing away, they carried two of the bodies, the boy Alexei and one of his sisters, some distance off, doused them in acid and gasoline, burned them, and crushed the charred bone with spade blades into a smaller separate pit. Read as forensic evidence, every one of those choices is a signature. Faces destroyed to prevent identification. Acid to erase soft tissue. A body count deliberately broken apart so the grave would read as the wrong size. This is the physical record of panic. A year later, the first serious investigator reached that ground. Nikolai Sokolov, working for the White Army that briefly retook the city, found the mine and the burn site and read them with real care. He recovered scorched bone fragments, Dr. Botkin's dentures and eyeglasses, corset stays and belt buckles, loose pearls and diamonds, spent bullets, and part of a severed woman's finger. From all of it, Sokolov concluded that the fire had consumed the whole family past recovery. He was reading genuine evidence. He had simply been steered to the wrong ground and drawn to the wrong ending, and his version stood as the official one for the next 60 years, and it failed anyway. Because bone is patient. When the main grave was finally opened, the skeletons showed exactly what the killer's own accounts had promised. Gunshot trauma, sharp force damage consistent with bayonets, and the cranial destruction, the shattered facial bones, inflicted deliberately after death to keep these people nameless. The forensic anthropologists worked backward from bone, estimating age from the growth plates and the teeth, sex from the pelvis and skull, stature from the long bones, matching the count and the injuries against the ages of a known family. I will be honest about the hardest part of reading this file. The wound patterns on the smallest and youngest of these skeletons, the record of individual close-range gunshots to the head of children, is the kind of finding a working pathologist learns to set down in flat clinical language precisely because the flat language is the only thing that lets you keep reading. The bones stay silent about the cruelty. They only record that these deaths came slowly and came up close. If you want this channel to keep opening files, the historical record closed and mislabeled, files like this one, the subscribe button is where you say so. Another case reaches this table most weeks. Now to the laboratory findings, because the smashed faces raise the last question, the one that belongs to this case alone. If the killers truly erase these faces beyond recognition, how does anyone know whose bones these are? The answer is the part of the story where the botch is finally undone, decades late, by a science beyond anything the killers could have pictured. The grave was located in secret in the mid-1970s by a Russian geologist named Alexander Avdonin, working quietly alongside a filmmaker, Geli Ryabov. They understood what they had found, and they said nothing, because in the Soviet Union of that decade, announcing that you had located the murdered imperial family was a dangerous thing to do. They held the secret for years. Only after the Soviet state collapsed did they come forward, and in 1991 the main grave was opened and 9 skeletons were lifted from the ground. 9. The killers had buried 9 here and destroyed 2 elsewhere. 2 were absent from this grave, exactly as Yurovsky's own account had predicted. The identification of the 9 came down to genetics. In 1994, a team led by Peter Gill in Britain and Pavel Ivanov in Russia pulled mitochondrial DNA from the bones. Mitochondrial DNA runs down the maternal line almost unchanged from one generation to the next, so a single living maternal relative can confirm a body across 100 years. For the Empress and her children, that relative was Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, who shares Alexandra's maternal line. His DNA matched the mother and the children in the grave exactly. The Emperor was the harder case. Nicholas's own mitochondrial DNA carried something unusual, a single position in the sequence where two different bases showed up in the same sample. We call that heteroplasmy, a natural mixture held within one person. A few researchers doubted the match because of it. So the Russian authorities exhumed the body of Nicholas's own brother, the Grand Duke Georgij, and tested him, and found the same heteroplasmy sitting at the same position in the sequence, carried in a different ratio. The very quirk that had cast doubt on the body turned out to be a family signature that confirmed it. A blood-stained shirt kept from an assassination attempt Nicholas survived in Japan in 1891 matched him as well. That same genetic work closed a mystery that had run for most of the century. For decades, a woman known as Anna Anderson had claimed to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia, escaped somehow from the cellar. When a preserved sample of her tissue was tested against the Romanov line, her mitochondrial DNA matched neither Prince Philip nor the bones. It matched a great-nephew of a Polish factory worker named Franciszka Szankowska. The woman who had spent a lifetime as the surviving daughter had never stood in that room at all. That accounted for 9. It left the 2 burned children from the separate pit still in the ground. Those bones stayed lost for another 16 years. In 2007, amateur searchers turned them up, about 70 meters from the main grave, right where the account placed the bonfire. Burned, fragmentary, crushed. In 2008 and 2009, teams that included Michael Cobble at the American Military DNA Laboratory tested the fragments. The family was whole. All 11 were finally accounted for. For years, there had been a real dispute about which daughter was missing. Working from the bones in the first grave, the Russian team and an American team of anthropologists reached opposite conclusions about whether the absent sister was Maria or Anastasia. The second grave settled it. Autosomal testing identified the burned girl as Maria, which meant Anastasia had been lying in the main grave the whole time. The argument the bones could not resolve, the genetics closed. The argument outlived the laboratory. When 9 of the remains were reburied in a state funeral at the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg in 1998, key figures of the Russian Orthodox Church stayed away, disputing that the bones belonged to the family at all. The 2 children recovered in 2007 still lie unburied. Their fragments wait in a state archive while the church asks for one more examination, more thorough than the last. More than a century on, the case the bones closed is one the record keeps trying to pry back open. Now put the whole thing together, the way the reconciliation always works. What the record said, set against what the body says. The record said a swift, clean execution. The body says a killing that failed at the first attempt, escalated through a bayonet detail that also failed, and ended in individual headshots delivered up close across the better part of 20 minutes. The record implied a thorough, final disposal. The body says a panicked improvisation in the mud. Acid poured into a road, faces broken with rifle butts, a grave deliberately split in 2 to lie about the count, and a secret the ground surrendered anyway. 2 claims of efficiency. 2 findings of chaos. The bones win. The bones always win. Now the formal finding, the way a report would read it. Cause of death across all 11 decedents is multiple gunshot wounds, with contributory sharp force injuries and, in several of the dead, close-range cranial gunshot wounds delivered as a separate and deliberate act after the opening volley failed to kill. Mechanism of death is a combination of exsanguination from the torso wounds and destruction of the central nervous system from the cranial wounds. For the 4 daughters, the mechanism deserves its own line, because the concealed layer of stones stopped the opening torso rounds from reaching a vital structure. So the mechanism that actually ended their lives was the later, aimed, point-blank wound to the head. Manner of death is homicide. 11 counts. A court order, a firing squad, and the word execution changed the politics around that finding. They leave the forensic classification precisely where it sits. A death caused by the deliberate act of another human being is a homicide. whether the hand that delivered it carried a warrant or none. The historical record filed these 11 deaths under efficient political execution. The word for what the evidence describes is not efficient. The word is botched, which carries us back to the staircase. 11 people walked down those stairs on the promise that they were being moved somewhere safe. 4 of them carried a fortune stitched against the skin, meant to buy a future none of them would live to see. That hidden fortune is the reason the first volley failed, the reason the killing turned long and clumsy and close. And in the end, part of the reason we can still read these remains at all. The stones that turned the bullets also helped mark the daughters as who they were. Girls carry 3 pounds of diamond into a grave only when someone has sewn it there on purpose. The killers tried to erase 11 people from the earth. They broke the faces so no one could name them. They poured acid to dissolve them, and fire to finish what the acid missed, and split the grave so the numbers would lie. And a maternal line running through a living prince, a heteroplasmy shared with a dead brother, and 70 meters of forest floor undid every piece of it. The men who did this wanted the last word to be silence. The bodies took the last word instead. They always do. If 4 young women went into the ground wearing an accidental armor of diamonds sewn against the chest, and the opening volley of a firing squad broke against it, and the record still called that execution clean and quick, what else do you think history is filed as efficient that the bones would refile as botched? Tell me which case you would lay on the table next. Thanks for watching.